Oregon's roster is going to be very different in 2025. Where should the recruiting focus be? Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. So if you have not already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonccollege. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn is also our recruiting sponsor here at the network. And as we kick off the week, we've got Brian Smith here at FBScout_Florida on X, formerly known as Twitter, to talk all things recruiting, Brian. So Oregon in the 2025 class. We'll get to the quarterbacks in just a sec, but they've heavily prioritized in the last two classes the defensive line. They've brought in guys from the portal as well, but they have loaded up with blue chip defensive line recruits who are already making an impact and will make an impact for the Ducks in 2023, 2024, and probably beyond as well. When you think about Oregon and how they've recruited that position, the fact that they're set at quarterback, where do you think Dan Lanning and company want to build out their class from there? Or do you think they don't have that much of an idea yet and they're waiting to see how a couple things play out?
Part of it's spring ball. I mean, did you have an injury? Do you have some spot you thought you were good, etc.? You kind of figure those things out. But let's first off give Dan and his staff in general credit. The last two recruiting classes are pretty darn good. So you're battling from a position of strength, and also you've recruited for 2 straight years to what you want to do. You and I have talked about many times. Recruit on defense, kind of like an SEC style team. They got Jaquan Roy, the kid. I don't even know how big he is. I was told 390.
Jaquan McCroy, you mean?
Yeah, McCroy. Yeah,
McCroy.
I mean, he was one of the biggest human beings I've ever seen. Like shaking his hand is a little scary, like literally. And I see a lot of large human beings living down here in the South. So anyway, the point is still the same. They could be a little choosier now. I don't think it's necessarily as position specific, but like they've already got a quarterback. They've already got a few other kids committed, et cetera, that are good. Now you could be more select. I'm not saying they can be Georgia selective, but pick guys. And then towards the middle of the cycle, because they do such a good job of scouring the country, Oregon does, because anybody, if there is a problem, they'll be able to go to it. Their situation's probably the most unique of any school in the country because they do such little amount in the state and it's so far out west, et cetera. It's kind of interesting just to follow the Ducks in recruiting in general.
Yeah, as they go into the Big Ten, I think, as you've discussed, it helps Oregon's brand. I don't think it, radically shifts the base, but certainly can get you, more exposure, whether in person or on TV, to different parts of the country. And I'll have a fascinating question for Brian at the end of today's show. But just bringing it back to 2025 for a moment and looking at the quarterbacks, which is always the most talked about position, right? Because, well, it's the most important position in all of sports. Oregon's got their 2025 plan. That's probably going to be Dante Moore. Austin Novosad is on the roster. He hasn't shown one way or the other whether he could, necessarily be a shoo-in as an Oregon starter one day. I think that's more of a 2025 offseason recruiting battle. You've got Luke Moga coming in the 2024 class. You've got Achilles Smith Jr. for the 2025 cycle. The portal's always available. I would be surprised if Oregon went after another quarterback. Would you?
The only way I see that is injury or some other form of attrition. I mean, I would assume that one of the guys is going to leave because that just happens to every program. But I mean, for the love of mankind, what else could you really do in a 2-year window more than what the Lanning and the Ducks have done? I mean, you've got a legacy that's sitting in the wings, and you got 2 kids from last class that are really highly rated Elite 11 guys. And for the record, I had Dante Moore as the #1 player in the country, and so did other people. I just don't see how you could really want to take 2 unless they know something I don't. Maybe there's some injuries or something like that, but barring unforeseen information coming out, you just take the kid here and then you go for the best 26 kid. That's how I would do it. So if anybody else has their opinion, fire away, but I think you only need 1.
Yeah, that's kind of where I land as well when you've got transfers just always so readily available. And Oregon's always going to attract big time transfers, right? Not just at the quarterback position, but at any position. But, the two transfers they brought in so far are Bo Nix, that went pretty well, and Dylan Gabriel. And I think we all expect that to go pretty well. And
100%.
He's top five. I don't think I've asked him or asked you about him before. What are kind of your impressions of Dylan Gabriel, quarterback?
Well, I covered him, excuse me, when I was covering UCF. Great guy, very down to earth, super accurate, loves the long ball. I think Oregon fans are going to like him. The other thing he'll do, though, is he's matured. If you're going to play cover 3, he'll 7-yard you to death. And then let's be honest, that drive for Oklahoma last year against Texas, dude, that was about as good a drive as you're going to get because, like I said, they, little here, little there, just took Texas's heart out piece by piece. That's not easy to do when you're under pressure and you want to chuck it, especially because that's what he normally does. That's a really good football player. I think he'll throw for 3,000 yards. Now the question is, who's guy catching it? Because they kind of lost a pretty good receiver.
Well, they did lose a pretty good receiver, but as I talked about last week on the show, Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson, that's one of the most dynamic receiver tandems that you've got in 2024. I'm curious to see which of those guys leads the Ducks in receiving because Stewart has got greater NFL potential. He's got the big play ability, right? That's where, Gabriel, as you mentioned, has really thrived. But Tez Johnson is a guy, Drake Stoops led Oklahoma in receiving last year. Tez Johnson is Drake Stoops, but better. He's I think, a little bit of a better athlete. Yeah, I think he's more fluid in his route running. He's more explosive, a little better yards after catch. And Drake Stoops is a good football player. But I think that's a fascinating thing to watch. But bringing this back to recruiting for the Ducks, I think defensive line, boy, they feel really set. Certainly they will add high-caliber defensive linemen in the class. But will it be as big of a focus? I don't know. That might depend on how many guys end up sticking around from the last couple of cycles, because typically in the trenches, guys might take a year or two to get themselves physically ready to go against Power 4 college football players, and that can be a bigger adjustment for some guys than for others, or like Jaquan McCroy. Could he come in and start at offensive tackle right away? I mean, he's big enough, but does he need to work himself, back into shape a little bit? The interesting one to me is running back, because after this season, Jordan James could be gone to the NFL. Noah Whittington almost certainly will be gone to the NFL. How many running backs do you think are a good or is a good number to have on the roster? Because Oregon could be looking at having just 2 or 3 after this season.
5 is the number I've been told that you want to be at, kind of minimum. A couple springs ago, I ran into a coach on the recruiting trail, and he told me that he was at 4 and it was too low of a number. I asked him why, and he says, in one practice and then the first play of the next game, you can be down to 2 guys, and that just can't happen. It's ironic. His name's Tony Alford, Ohio State, and that year Ohio State started a true freshman. He started out the year 4th string. You know what? It's true. That position takes on a lot of attrition. So you need at least 4, and that's minimum, preferably 5, with at least 2 of those 5 being guys that have taken a lot of reps. It's hard. You do rotate running backs, though. And Oregon has a tremendous running back coach, too, and they also have found a good way to find roles for guys. So if they should take 2 this year if they can. If you take 1, it's got to be a complete dude, and then I would still take a transfer, even if he's kind of a journeyman, just to help you with practice reps and the emergency situation.
Yeah, I mean, they've got Riggs in the 2024 class. You have Jade Lamar on the roster as well. They brought in Jay Harris, the transfer from, I think it was Northwest Missouri State, was the Division II school. But, sure, Jordan James doesn't have to go to the NFL. I'm just saying he could be ready to do so because he might very well be the feature back for Oregon this season, or at least he'll certainly be one of them along with Noah Whittington. But I think that's kind of the offensive position to watch because they've already got 3 receiver commits in the 2025 cycle, along with a defensive lineman and a quarterback, Achilles Smith Jr. They brought in several receivers in the 2024 class who probably won't play a lot this year. You'll still probably have Jurion Dickey on the roster. So the running back is the position, at least offensively, that I'm most interested to see. But coming up, Brian was kind enough to do a little bit of film study, and my film study skills are moderate at best. And so Brian, the pro, is going to bring his breakdown of 2 new Oregon defensive backs right after we talk about LinkedIn Jobs, of course, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. It's why 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's where you go, linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Brian, my audience loves perhaps more than anything your film breakdown of Oregon players. We've talked about a couple guys in this incoming transfer / high school class, and I want to go to the defensive backfield because that's a place where Oregon has, certainly made a lot of changes because they have had to. They lost a bunch of guys from the starting or regular rotation a season ago. I think they've brought in a number of good guys. But I want to start with a freshman who I talked about last week on the show. We'll begin with one of Oregon's highest rated recruits in the 2024 cycle. That's Ify Obidegwu from the Baltimore, Maryland area, St. Francis Academy over there. Played against a really, really tough level of competition. What do you see from him at the cornerback position?
He's a kid that could play 4 positions, really: running back, free safety, corner, or nickel. He's
running back?
Oh, yeah, he could. Athletically? Oh, hell yes. In today's game?
Is that something that you see a lot from a corner where you look at him on film and say, oh, he could play running back?
Well, the reason I bring that up in today's game, not 1985, you would throw him the ball a lot and use him in different roles. Who was the little Thomas, the running back Oregon had 10, 15 years ago from LA?
D'Anthony Thomas.
Yeah. Like, get him out in space. Who tackled him in space one-on-one?
Nobody.
Exactly. Running back today is different. So put an asterisk by that. But the point is still the same. His feet are great. When you have great feet, you have options. I like him at corner or nickel, kind of depending on what he wants to do. But at the same time, if you're going to play in the Big 10 or the Big 28, whatever it is coming up here, this league stuff has gotten ridiculous. But
it's the Big 18, baby.
That sounds so terrible.
It really does. That's why they're keeping it at the Big 10.
I agree with that assessment. I agree wholeheartedly. But I think he's physical enough at his size. He's 180-ish, give or take. He's listed at 6'1", so he's probably 6 foot. And he played against a schedule that's ridiculous. They play IMG every year. They'll play other private schools in Florida, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania. They don't care. And he's able to hang with anybody. He's a guy that went out and got offers from a ton of schools early. There's a reason he showed out early. Corner is a spot you can't hide. It's arguably the easiest spot for me to do film breakdowns. You watch 3 or 4 clips, and if it's a true player in front of the guy in question, you can't hide it. There's nobody around you, nothing blocking your view. Like offensive guard's awful. If he is making cuts and moves that make you say, okay, this guy's got a chance to one day get paid if everything went right. It's a big if, but you never know. And he's got really long arms. So if nothing else fails, just try to deflect it with your fingernail. It still changes the play, and it's a PBU. That's why Oregon, and quite frankly, about half the country offered him a scholarship. He's going to play early at Oregon.
So you mentioned that he could play corner or he could play nickel, and it's not the first time you've mentioned potential versatility for an Oregon newcomer. Sione Laulea, you said, could maybe move back and play some safety. But when you look at a guy on film and say, all right, he's a cornerback, but I could see him playing nickel, what traits are you looking for? What stood out about Ify Obidegwu in that respect?
2 things. It goes back to their schedule. Like the teams they're playing against, there's no shyness about going against teams that Power 5 kids. If you can't tackle in space and take on bigger dudes, they're going to screen you to death when you're like that kid because they don't want to throw against you down the field, so they try to beat you up. Toss, sweep, RPO, screens, and you got to be able to take it. He could do it, so that's toughness. And then the other part about it is he's a Baltimore kid. If you're from that area, you're probably a pretty tough kid. So playing nickel in today's game, 5'9" kid. Then on the next play, 6'5", 250. It's a tight end trying to block you on one of those screens. Somebody's got to do it. You're going to lose. Just don't lose terribly. No 180 kid's going to win the battle against the 250-pound tight end very often. So He's a savvy player. He can find different ways to do things. And that's why I also mentioned free safety. There's nothing wrong with moving to free safety in today's world because it's a mental thing. He just kind of reminds, and I don't know him, but he reminds me of a kid that eventually could play that spot, whether college or pro, and direct everybody in front of it. If you're not lined up right, one of those generic, everybody in the stadium knows it's coming screens, it's a touchdown. That's why they run them constantly and everybody gets mad. Because if you miss, it's touchdown. He's the kind of guy that can help you in multiple roles with that.
I think his path to playing time with the Ducks is difficult because of the depth chart for this particular season, but I like his upside a lot. He reminds me a bunch of Christian Gonzalez, who Oregon just had get drafted in the first round, and
that's
a couple things. I'm glad you think so, because I spend time doing my film breakdowns here, and if I've got Brian's stamp of approval, oh, that just made my day right here. Now I'm going to have a great day, and I was already having a pretty good one there. Okay, so bringing it back to him, though, the thing that I noticed on his huddle highlights was it seemed to me that his good coverage moments rarely included actually hitting the ball and was more about him staying with wide receivers and struggling to separate, which is a great quality. But when you go against guys who, were also 4- or 5-star recruits and big-time players and 20 offers and such, do you feel like that's an aspect of his game that he'll have to improve upon once he gets to Oregon?
I think at Oregon, you got to be able to be more multiple. At the high school level, let's be honest. I've talked to coaches about this for years, and it'll never change. There's always a guy like him in the state of Florida somewhere. Any county I go to, Florida's loaded with him. But that team, if they're playing him at corner, like most of the good corners play free safety in high school. You can avoid a corner on one side of the field. You can't, because they just throw to the other side. That's what happened to this young man quite a bit. If they put him at free safety, not as much. But St. Francis got guys all over the place, so it just didn't matter. They're still going to avoid him for the most part. But when he gets to the next level and they're playing more zone, because like Ohio State runs bunch all the time. You can't play man. If you do, you're going to get destroyed.
Right.
That's why everybody runs bunch. That's why Nick Saban's scheme, although it's super complex, you almost have to run something similar to it. It's a match switch scheme for all these bunch sets. That's what you got to be able to pick up. So if he can figure that part out, and I have no idea. Every kid, it's random. That's all mental stuff. It's zero to do with your technique. That's the key for him and for anybody that Lanning brings in. If he does that, though, and you can figure out some cover 3, cover 2, and kind of match with the player in front of him, every week is different. It's almost like the NBA, where you're going against the 6'7" wing guard, and then you're going against that Curry guy the next night in Golden State, totally different kind of player, but they're both 2 guards. He has to be able to identify that and be able to change his craft each game. Big Ten's going to be loaded with good receivers. So I think he's the guy that could be your number 1 at some point. Can he take those steps to learn that? Because right now, he just shadows everybody. You're right.
Right.
But I'm okay with that. Like, that's a great starting point. Most kids can't even do that.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with you there. So Kam Alexander, transfer from UTSA, I think is one of the biggest wild cards for Oregon in this secondary, because he's a guy who was all conference with the Roadrunners, a season ago, and comes over from the American Athletic Conference, maybe the best group of 5 along with the Mountain West in the country right now. So he was playing against some solid competition. 24/7's got him as a 4-star transfer. All conference guy. What do you see from him, and how do you think he can fit into Dan Lanning's defensive scheme?
Smart player, makes the it play. I don't think his upside is the same as Ify, but he's at the same time, when he breaks on the ball, he knows he's breaking on the ball. He doesn't wait around. It's automatic. And that's something as a DB, you better be confident, because you're going to miss eventually. I don't care who you are. You're going to miss eventually, and it's going to go over your head. It is what it is. It doesn't bother him because, I mean, they had games they gave up a bunch of points too, just like everybody else in college football. I mean, Georgia gives up a lot of points. The point is still the same, though. He'll come back on that next series and make a big hit, PBU, pick, whatever. And he's another kid, very similar to the one we just talked about. He can play nickel for you. He can play boundary. He can play whatever. I have zero idea what they want to do long-term in terms of their corners, but you need versatility anyway. He's another kid that can do that. I'm not saying he's going to take Ohio State's number 1 and throw him into the bench, but he's going to be competitive. Worst case scenario for the Ducks, they got another guy that can help in their rotation. I think he'll probably find a starting spot or a key role in nickel or dime at worst, and he's probably trying to get more exposure going up to play at Oregon as well. And I get it.
Right.
I think it was a pretty good move, to be honest with you, because Oregon's got a good D. Now, can he prove it against higher level competition? Kind of like I was just talking about with the other young man, but he's on the spot now.
Right.
Like, he has to do it this year. It's a great story, and I hope he does well.
Yeah, because his career began all the way back at Sam Houston State when they were an FCS school. I believe he was part of their national championship winning team there, then went to UTSA, now comes to Oregon for what I believe is also his final year of eligibility. So he's definitely in that prove-it sort of mindset. But I've got a couple more questions for Brian. Rather, you all have a couple questions for Brian, which we'll get to after we talk about FanDuel, which is where you can get buckets with America's #1 sportsbook, that is FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. If you haven't heard, FanDuel has Oregon tied for the highest win total in all of college football at 10.5. And if Oregon hits that, now you'd have to wait a little bit longer on the payout there, so maybe you want to get some NBA action in the meantime, just bet against the Blazers, usually a pretty good bet. $150 if you get a $5 bet as a new customer and it wins. You can bet all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel.com/lockedon to get everything you need. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, Brian, let's wrap up with a couple of mailbag questions here. YouTube comments, or X, formerly known as Twitter, at @McLaughlinCFB or @LockedOnDucks. You can also get priority access by joining the flock over at Subtext and become a Locked On Ducks insider. You get all sorts of perks, free 14-day trial. Then it's just $5 a month. Not a requirement, absolutely not, but you do get benefits for being a paid subscriber. Questions came in from Bud over there. It seems that there are some powerhouse football high schools on the West Coast that continually produce top recruits, such as Mater Dei and Santa Ana, De La Salle, St. John Bosco. How important is it for a college coaching staff to develop relationships with those schools' coaches to have access to their players? And before I turn that over to you, Brian, the other aspect of this question that it kind of made me think about is, as Oregon goes to the Big Ten, how does their relationship with these Southern California schools that have produced so many high-level prospects change now that they're playing a schedule that includes games in West Lafayette, Indiana, and Madison, Wisconsin?
The second part's actually the easier one, believe it or not. First off, it is paramount that you have relationships. Let me put it to you this way. In the 80s and through the 90s, Carson Palmer era, etc., when SC was beating the bejesus out of everybody, they just destroyed everybody with LA recruiting. They got all the kids from Snoop Dogg's old high school, et cetera, that had all these players. They got the Mater Dei kids, the St. John Bosco kids, et cetera. Now they don't. SC was 7-5 last year. They've lost the relationships. Yes, it matters. Oregon, meanwhile, even though they had a staff that wasn't all from the West Coast, they had enough that were, that helped Dan eventually adapt, and he probably visited there anyway because he was on Alabama and Georgia's staff, so he knew it. They have prioritized. So that makes it a lot easier when you get a kid on your campus and he signs, then you go recruit somebody the next year when they come up for an unofficial or official. Guess who hosts them on that visit? A kid they already know. It's paramount. You got to get that first when you break the window, but after you get through, you're good. As for the second part, USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon are all going to the Big Ten. If it was only Oregon, I'd be concerned, but they're all going, and those are the primary recruiting programs on the West Coast. So I don't think it's going to matter much. These kids are going to be moving across the country to play games all the time, whether they want to or not. It is what it is.
So when you talk about exposure and being on a kid's radar and, you know, getting a bigger foothold recruiting-wise kind of in the Midwest part of the country, is it more about the television times, or is it more about the in-person games that kids go to, aware of, hear buzz about, or anything like that?
It's a little of both, but I think the biggest thing will actually be Dan and his staff physically. One of the things you do, like I'll just use an example because I lived in Florida. They hated playing games in Florida when teams come down because it's hard to beat the Florida schools. But the advantage is you come down on, like, one or two of your guys will come down on a Thursday, get everything set up or whatever, or maybe Friday morning, and everybody's flying in. They're going to see certain recruits. There are certain games that I know that I'm going to see certain coaches. that are coming because I know they're playing at UF or at Florida State. Well, the same thing, like in Ohio, it's a loaded state. Do you really think Dan is not going to take advantage to go see some kid in Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Columbus, Cleveland, or whatever? They'll physically be there. And when I talk to kids after high school games, one of the questions I always ask, who'd you notice on the side? It's a loaded question. Who'd you notice? Well, the head coach is right over there, Dan Lanning. Of course he's going to say Dan Lanning. You want to physically be seen. That is the biggest key. They're going to end up getting a few kids from like Illinois and stuff, and you're going to be like, what's going on? It's because they're playing games in the Midwest, like they play in Chicago, and they play at Northwestern. It's basically in Chicago. They're going to get a kid from Illinois that year. You watch. Being seen physically, right there is Dan Lanning. That matters.
Last thing for you today, Brian, and what has been a fantastic show, as always, is another mailbag question. How have college coaches, I know you love sounding off on this stuff, had to adapt to maintain a strong team bond, given the potential issues coming from the transfer portal and NIL and their potential to create conflict and toxic environments?
Do you have 7 hours?
No, we here at Locked On, we focus on, 30-ish minute shows to work into people's daily routines, but we could spread out this content over 7 hours, perhaps.
It's really the biggest question. I like to use the guys that are winning rings to use as a reference point. And I've mentioned it probably on this show as well. After Florida State was curb stomped by Kirby and the Dogs, yes, pun intended, he made it reference. He took 2 shots with one reference. Basically just dropped all over the NCAA about not having anything going on with the portal. And this is why we're in this conundrum. They didn't act anywhere near close enough in time, which there's no debating that. And then secondly, he said, look, if you're going to be successful in this business, you have to recruit high school kids. How do you do that? You do not spend time with your family. I mean, that's a mic drop right off the bat. I mean, there's a reason that coaches have an insanely high rate with divorce. You don't see your family a lot. So it just is what it is. But Kirby talked about his staff, what they do, et cetera. Like Mario, I mean, he coached at Oregon. Now those guys are insane. They do a great job, but they don't spend a lot of time at home. That's what you have to do. You got to get all those kids to buy in. If you pick the right kids in recruiting, you do your due diligence, you go through those meetings, then you don't have these problems with the chemistry. You still got to be careful with the NIL, and this is the parting shot. If you bring in an elite kid because you bought him, and there's a lot of schools doing it, we all know who they are, and it's just part of it. Eventually, it's going to bite you in any one given year. I know I'm not going to name schools. There's a few schools that have lost locker rooms at least periodically because Johnny over here in this locker got more than Timmy in the locker right down the road. There's no friendly there because part of the time, it's not even the school setting it up. The kid went and got the NIL deal. Now, he doesn't know the head coach didn't set it up with it, but it causes some fires. I don't know if you can fix that. And sometimes you just lose because of it. It's an individual sport now in a team game because there's 85 guys on scholarship. And given the time for, I'd say it's still around 20 that you have are walk-ons too. It's a lot of players. It is a full-time management job, and that's why I did an episode on Locked On Seminoles recently about the most important position other than a head coach is the new GM role or whatever you want to call it at every single school. If that person is not elite, you are screwed. Your head coach will be mitigated. You will not be a championship level team.
Yes. So for Oregon, that person is Marshall Malkow, who's the director of player personnel. He was at Texas A&M, came over to the Ducks, and I think has done a really good job. And that team cohesion is now one of the essential elements of being a head coach. It's why not many head coaches call plays. I mean, Lincoln Riley does, Steve Sarkisian does. I think Hugh Freeze at Auburn is going to, but Ryan Day's not doing it anymore. Chip Kelly isn't a head coach. Jed Fish at Washington will call plays, but the overwhelming majority of head coaches have to be able to foster a culture of success because it's always been a part of it, but it is just exacerbated in a huge way. Huge, because transfer portal kids, everyone has to integrate quickly to, the culture that you're trying to build. And then the NIL factor that you brought up, and Oregon's not immune to these sorts of things. It's just a matter of whether or not they can handle it well. And obviously over the last couple of seasons, they've done a very good job. And I expect Lanning to continue to be able to do that. But it is certainly a difficult task, to say the least, because this happens in the NFL where you have, more personnel and more coaches and whatnot. you're also dealing with adults. These are kids. These are
22, man. It's big.
Yeah, 18 to 22. Those really are kids, and that's a tough thing to manage. But you're either built for it or you're not, and I think Dan Lanning really is. We are always built here at Locked On Ducks to have Brian Smith on the show at FBScout_Florida. If you want to give him a follow, Brian, thank you so much. As always, brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
One quick note, everybody. Bear with me here. No show tomorrow. Show will be back on Wednesday, fear not, but you're going to have to enjoy a Tuesday without Locked On Ducks. I'm sure you'll survive. I'm always available at smclaughlincfb, or I have my handle wrong. I just realized that. Well, it's at smclaughlincfb. That's the handle on Twitter, at Locked On Ducks. DMs and mentions wide open. If you're at subtext, shoot me messages. I'm not going to go dark on my phone, but no show tomorrow, back on Wednesday. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.